And that story actually it is relevant in what we saw with Alex Pretty's death. That scene really escalates when a Border Patrol officer fires pepper spray at his face, causing disorientation, and several officers pile on. It'd be hard to imagine anyone in that scene really had their bearings of what's going on as those noxious chemicals are floating around.
J. David McFarlane, I want to thank you for being with us, investigative reporter at ProPublica. We will link to your new piece, The Two CBP Agents Identified in Alex Pretty's Shooting, and your previous pieces, including Trump's immigration forces deploy so-called less lethal weapons in dangerous ways, skirting rules and maiming protesters. To come to our February 23rd, 30th anniversary event, go to democracynow.org.
The viewpoints expressed in this program are the opinions of the people expressing them and are not necessarily those of Fresh Air Incorporated, its staff, or its board of directors.
Hi, this is Al McFarlane, host of The Conversation with Al McFarlane. You're listening to 90.3 FM, KFAI, Minneapolis. I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to The Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to have you along as well. Today is February 2nd, 2026, the beginning of Black History Month. Our thanks, as always, to the station KFAI for creating this platform, allowing us to connect with you and community. And our thanks to all of our teams who create our social media presence. We're streaming this program live on YouTube at the channel for the Black Press USA, the National Newspaper Publishers Association, on the Inside News channel. We're streaming to Facebook and LinkedIn as well. Wherever you're connecting, we want to connect with you, to have you involved in the conversation. Follow the chats. We'll be monitoring those. If you have questions for our guests, we'll try to post them and shout you out in the process. Today is a wonderful program, an exciting one. I'm pleased to have as my guest Dr. Gerald Horne, and joining me as well is Professor the Griot, the Dean in the Black community, Mahmoud El-Kati. Gerald Horne currently holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at University of Houston. He is an activist, a scholar, a researcher, an archivist, an author, historian, an attorney, and much, much more. He's written over 50 books. His latest book, which is available for purchase at the International Publishers website, is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1893, the Hawaii Coup, and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism in the Asia-Pacific Basin. He's a permanent guest on the radio show Bring It On, which airs on Black Power 96 radio on Sundays. This is on the West Coast, I believe, at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. He also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific Time. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. I took this bio from listening to a podcast of his yesterday at the Activist News Network. Great show, great beginning. And so one of the things he talked about yesterday was his book called The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., from 1800 to 1865. It was a book published in 2025. And maybe in the course of today's conversation, he'll mention that book. What struck me in the interview I heard yesterday was the notion that he described our capital as a what was the right word for it? Slave pen, that Washington, D.C. was a seat of the slave market in this country. And I think I'd love to hear more about that as well. Well, Mahmoud is off camera right now, but maybe the connection will come in a few minutes. Dr. Horne is here. Dr. Horne, let me begin with you. Welcome you to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let me do this. I mentioned before the show, I've got several things on my mind. I'd like to spit them all out at one time, and you can take it anywhere you want to go. Here's Mahmoud. Let me bring him into this. Mahmoud is one of the guys that told me that this conversation with you coming up this Friday is really important. Mahmoud, how you doing, brother? Go ahead, Mahmoud. And maybe you're not hearing me, so we'll come back to that. That's fine. So Dr. Horne, I had several broad questions, and and during the course of this interview, I want to invite people to the event where you'll be speaking this week here in Twin Cities at McAllister College. It's a very important thing. Dr. Horne, what do you think about Minneapolis right now? We're in the middle of the news again in this country and actually around the world behind the recent murders of Renee Good and Alex Pretty by U.S. government forces. And what are your thoughts on that, looking back to the fact that this was the scene of the George Floyd murder by the Minneapolis police some 5 years ago? And there's what I call a police invasion of Minneapolis, but what's the connection between that and the Trump invasion of Caracas, Venezuela? Are there threats that are international in nature that somehow connect to the pressure and the challenges we're experiencing on the ground here in our local community, in communities around the country? For example, the Trump administration has threatened Iran, threatened Canada, Cuba, and are there threats to African nations? And is there a separation between us and those threats, or do those things affect us? Is this our business or not? Should we be concerned about these international concerns or not? International is the key word. I'll throw this out too. Pardon this long intro, but I think this gives you a running ramp to go wherever you want to go, Dr. Horne. We talk in community here about foundational Black Americans versus an internationalist view of how we move forward as a community. What are your thoughts on that? My thinking is guided by the attention I'm paying to what's happening in particularly Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso, they seem to be rewriting the terms of engagement between Africa and Europe, between the systems of extraction and the need and the awareness to understand what sovereignty means anew and how to enact that on the ground. And how does that relate to us in this country? So I'll stop there. And welcome to the show, Dr. Horne.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Obviously, you asked a series of complicated questions. I don't know if I can answer them all in one fell swoop, but if you want to return to repose a question, feel free to do so.
Yes.
To a certain degree, as I will argue at McAllister College this coming Friday when I arrive in the Twin Cities, to a certain extent, there's a certain inevitability to this crisis in Minneapolis. As I plan to argue, it's the inevitable result of decisions that were taken decades ago, not least taken in the Gopher State. I'm referring, for example, to this fact that oftentimes is glossed over. Why is it that the Democratic Party affiliate in the state of Minnesota is known as the DFL, the Democratic Former Labor Party? Well, that goes back to a decision that was made in the 1940s when the left-leaning Former Labor Party was swallowed by the Democratic Party under the leadership of the future Vice President Hubert Horatio Humphrey, a favorite son of Minnesota. But even though many historians, even those who consider themselves to be of the left, consider that to be a step forward, in my estimation, as I will seek to explain on Friday, it was not. In fact, there is another Minnesota angle to this story. You're probably familiar with Roy Wilkins, who was the leader of the NAACP for a good deal of the post-World War II era. He was instrumental, for example, in purging W.E.B. Du Bois from the NAACP in 1948. What I'm seeking to suggest is that there was a kind of Faustian bargain that Humphrey and Wilkins was involved in post-1945. where in return for a retreat to a degree of the more horrible aspects of Jim Crow, that there would be certain civil rights accorded to the larger Black community. Now, if you look at what Samuel Myers of the University of Minnesota said in the New York Times just the other day, he said that the Black people in Minnesota are probably worse off than any other Black community in the United States. So certainly that Faustian bargain did not necessarily work out for Black Minnesotans. But at the same time, it helped to empower the right, because part of the bargain was an attack on the left, an undermining of the left, particularly the left and trade unions, for example. Roy Wilkins not only was a staunch opponent of W.E.B. Du Bois, he was not only a staunch opponent of Paul Robeson, the tallest tree in our forest, the singer, actor, lecturer, linguist, etc., who in some ways was a symbolic leader of the left in the post-World War II era. He was harassed and persecuted by the U.S. authorities, finally driven into exile, like so many others before us. And the fact is that bargain that was brokered by Roy Wilkins didn't work out. And there's another local angle as well, as I'll tell the story. A former fiance of Roy Wilkins was Marvell Cook, who grew up in the Prospect Park neighborhood of Minneapolis, for example, helped to desegregate that neighborhood. As Roy Wilkins was turning away from the left, she rushed into the embrace of the left, became a close comrade of Paul Robeson after she migrated to Harlem in the post-World War II era. And this story of Wilkins and Cook in some ways sums up the crisis in which we find ourselves, because what happened with these bargains struck by Humphrey and Wilkins, once again, was that the left was marginalized, and like a seesaw, as the left was marginalized and went down in terms of influence and potency, the right ascended, for example. And voila, there you have the election of Donald J. Trump. There you have his sending jackbooted thugs into the streets of Minneapolis and St. Paul, because as the former coach of the Green Bay Packers, Vince Lombardi, once said, if you're attacking a team, you should attack it at its strength. And the Twin Cities are regarded as a citadel of progressivism. And the idea is that if you can destabilize the Twin Cities, then the weaknesses of our movement will be exposed and revealed elsewhere, making it easier for the Trumpistas to prevail. This also ties into the international situation that you so cogently mentioned, because part of what's happening internationally is that the cowboy tactics of Mr. Trump has not only alienated erstwhile allies, for example, Denmark over this Greenland crisis and the threat to impose tariffs, for example, on the European Union, but he's ratcheted up tensions with both Iran and Cuba. It's unclear which one will be attacked first, probably Iran, which would open the gates of hell. And as the international crisis heats up, there will inevitably be domestic opposition. And this demonstration project in Minneapolis, St. Paul, is exemplifying what will happen to those who surge into the streets if and when conflict is ignited with Iran. And once again, Mr. Trump has no answer for the affordability crisis, which he calls a con job and a hoax. He's trying to distract attention from the Epstein files, which are really a bombshell in terms of what it exposes, in terms of the misdeeds of the ruling class of the United States, particularly these so-called tech bros in Silicon Valley and these Wall Street leaders, so-called, et cetera. So this is a polycrisis, to coin a phrase. And when you have a polycrisis so profound and deep as this country faces, inevitably the iron hammer of repression is brought down, and inevitably that iron hammer is brought down on the Twin Cities, which once again are seen as being in the vanguard of progressivism, the vanguard of, quote, liberalism, unquote, and therefore is destined to suffer unless and until we can turn the tables.
So what's the connection between George Floyd and Renee Good and Alex Preddy? How do you describe that?
Well, first of all, respect due to those who have fallen victim to the repression of the state. One of the points that I'm going to make on Friday at McAllister College is to cite the words of the late Martinican intellectual Aimé Césaire when he was seeking to explain the brutality of fascism in the 1930s and the 1940s. And he argued there that in order to understand Central and Eastern Europe in the 1930s and 1940s, you had to understand European colonialism in the Caribbean and Africa, because what the fascists were seeking to do in the 1930s and 1940s in Europe, they had perpetrated in Africa, in Latin America, and the Caribbean in particular. And I'm going to add a corollary to the Césaire thesis. A country which is based upon mass enslavement of Africans, mass dispossession of the indigenous. As you probably know more than most, the Twin Cities are also a citadel of Native American resistance, which has gotten quite a bit of reportage in the news lately. And some of us recall what happened during the US Civil War, when one of the largest mass executions in the history of this country took place at the behest of then US President Abraham Lincoln, when dozens of Dakota warriors were executed because they were trying to resist the devastation of settler colonialism. And so my Césaire corollary is that a country that is based on violence and is founded on violence, you should not be surprised when violence rears its ugly head, as it did with the on-camera slaying of George Floyd, as it did with the killing of Renee Good, as it did with the murder or the killing of Mr. Preddy, for example. In other words, I think, to coin a phrase, the chickens are coming home to roost, or to quote, ironically, Abraham Lincoln, you cannot escape history. You might be able to forget it, but it will not forget you.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. My guest today is Professor Gerald Horne. Also joining us is Minneapolis, St. Paul historian, Professor Mahmoud El-Kati. Mahmoud, you were in and out earlier. I think you're back now. Let's bring you on camera. There we go. How can you hear us okay, Mahmoud?
I think so.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for being a part of our welcoming committee for Dr. Horne. I wanted your comments, your thoughts on what he said so far, but most of all, you and I talked yesterday or earlier in the week about how important this lecture this week is going to be. What are your thoughts?
First of all, I want to thank Dr. Horne for coming to our city. I am a great, almost just beyond the words, of ordinary words. I'll say to you this, what was said, and I've listened to you a little while, scanned about 7 of your books. What was said of Duke Ellington's music, I will say of Dr. Horne, you are beyond category. That's it. You're beyond category.
Fair enough.
Good as I've ever heard.
Mahmoud.
I don't want to talk, actually. I want to listen.
Well, thank you. Thank you. For...
Thank him so much for coming to our lectureship. We are the beneficiaries of a great transformative voice who joins the great intellectual traditions going back to William.
Your voice is Mahmoud, so yeah.
Feeling.
Well, let me do this because your signal is coming in and out. Let me keep it moving. We've got a graphic of the event. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just saying, Dr. Horne is a part of that line, that long line of Black intellectuals going back to slavery, where our tradition begins. People who think beyond what we see. And I'll stop on this note by James Baldwin. You've managed to describe or to confine what he said. And this is a moment you're defining, I think. And he said, the world is not white. People need to understand that. It's not black either. The future of this world belongs to everyone. And that future depends on to what extent and by what means we liberate ourselves from a vocabulary which cannot now bear the weight of reality. You said it.
Mahmoud, thank you. Well, here on our screen, and for the imagination of those who are listening on the radio, we've got the flyer promoting the Mahmoud El-Kati Distinguished Lectureship in American Studies. And the flyer says, join us for an illuminating lecture by Professor Horne, one of today's most incisive historians of race, class, and imperial power. The topic for the presentation, Friday, February 6th, at Alexander G. Hill, I think it's G. Hill Ballroom, Clayton Commons at McAllister. The topic is How Trump Happened, A View from History. And the program, doors open 6:30, program 7 to 8:30. You don't want to miss it. And we're talking to Dr. Horne right now. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Horne. I wanted to, taking up from your first comments, ask you about Minneapolis and St. Paul and the federal invasion here as a demonstration project. One of the people I talked to earlier said the demonstration, which meant the readiness or the readying of Army troops that are in Alaska and posturing them for Minnesota, that Minnesota isn't the objective. How do you prepare troops that are prepared for the weather out of Alaska for duty, and Minneapolis, again, a demo, perhaps for something that could happen in Greenland? And then secondly, I raised the question about how African Americans should interpret or engage or not in the protest demonstrations or whatever here in Minnesota and around that our people need to sit this one out and let the progressive white do this battle, because too often they've relied on our energy to move the needle towards justice where they benefit and we continue to lose. Finally, you may have a comment about Don Lemon and Georgia Fort, two journalists that were arrested and are now going to be charged, have been charged by our government for their involvement in a protest at a church here in St. Paul. What do you think?
Well, with regard to the latter, this attempt to bring criminal charges against two journalists, once again, it's a demonstration project. It's an attempt to intimidate the journalists. We are all familiar with Mr. Trump walking away with hefty settlements with ABC. For example, the attempt to sack late night hosts, including Jimmy Kimmel, the successful attempt to oust Stephen Colbert from the airwaves after David Ellison, the son of Larry Ellison, one of the richest men on planet Earth, was able to take control of CBS News and put into the driver's seat Barry Weiss, who had left the New York Times in fury and anger some months ago, and is hardly qualified to manage such a sprawling enterprise. But there you have it. You'll be interested to know that Barry Weiss is represented in the aforementioned Epstein files. In fact, if we had more time, and perhaps someone could raise a question on Friday, we could talk about how the Epstein files in many ways are a lens through which one can understand many of the frailties and debilities and outrages of the U.S. ruling elite as a whole. But back to Lemon and Fort, you also see the domestic consequences and the global consequences. What I mean is that even if these prosecutions fail, most likely they will, inevitably they will have accomplished a task, because Don Lemon, I know, has hired one of the most expensive Washington lawyers walking the face of the earth. Speaking of Abby Lowell, also the lawyer for Lisa Cook, the Black woman who Mr. Trump tried to oust from the Federal Reserve, also the lawyer for Attorney General Letitia James, who Mr. Trump tried to send to prison as well because she won a lawsuit against him. And so Don Lemon is going to be tied up in court when he could be reporting on what's going on in the streets. Don Lemon is going to have to spend a pretty penny to pay Abby Lowell, and that will limit his ability to bring to us first-class journalism. And you can see that same model exemplified internationally. For example, in order to keep Cuba afloat, you see that China has rushed $80 million in aid to Havana. You see that Russia is going to try to supply Cuba with the petroleum that is now
bandwidth issue could be on my computer here.
That is now been.
I'll ask.
Should I continue? Okay, that has now been cut off from Venezuela, and of course Mexico likewise has been pressured to curtail petroleum shipments to Cuba. So in other words, just like Don Lemon and Georgia Fort are being pressured and therefore taking off the front lines of journalism, you have Mexico, China, and Cuba, instead of husbanding resources to confront U.S. imperialism, they're having to rush resources to Cuba. With regard to internationalism, for example, it's no secret that a lot of my work has exemplified the positive aspects of internationalism. Indeed, as I said in my book on the Haitian Revolution, Confronting Black Jacobins, obviously homage to the book The Black Jacobins by the late Trinidadian scholar C.L.R. James, you cannot begin to understand the abolition of slavery in the United States in the 1860s without understanding the Haitian Revolution. You cannot be able to, you won't be able to understand the retreat from the more horrible aspects of Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid, post-1945, without understanding how the United States was embarrassed on the international scene by U.S. apartheid at a time when African and Caribbean nations were surging to power, and Washington thought that it could curry favor with these latter nations if it retreated from the more horrible aspects of Jim Crow. The problem today is that because of what happened to such past leaders as Paul Robeson and Du Bois, who were internationalists to the core, you have many of our leaders today who do not think international. For example, many in the international community have been captivated by the speech given by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at Davos, Switzerland, just a few days ago. In that speech, among other things, I found it remarkable that the former British colony that revolted in 1776 to establish the United States of America was confronted by the former British colony north of the border that did not revolt. And now you have a confrontation between those two forces because Mr. Carney is trying to organize, by his own admission, a bloc of nations to confront U.S. imperialism. I bring that up because one would think that if our leadership and our organizations were operating normatively, that they would be rushing delegations to Ottawa to confer with Mark Carney, or in the case of the Twin Cities, rushing delegations to Manitoba, just across the border, to confer with our Canadian friends about our mutual problems and mutual approaches. But that sort of approach has not apparently occurred. And just to conclude on this point, it brings us back once again to the Twin Cities. It brings us back to the son of Rondo, St. Paul, speaking of Roy Wilkins, the leader of the NAACP during pivotal and crucial moments, who had a face-off with his former fiancee, Marvell Cook, of Prospect Park, Minneapolis. And we are still living through the ramifications and repercussions of their breakup, so to speak, because they went in two different political directions. Unfortunately, the bulk of our community followed Roy Wilkins when they should have followed Marvell Cook.
If you would, Dr. Horne, about internationalism as a strategy versus a more nationalist or myopic view. The notion that you hear from the advocates of the Foundation of Black Americans that these problems are not ours, that we've got history for us begins with our presence here. Broad or bandwidth issues. You can, as long as your signal's clear, just go ahead, Dr. Horne.
Well, I find that approach troubling because it misreads history. Matter of fact, I wonder if folks are keeping up with history. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there are a number of positive and enormously positive developments in the writing of history. Now, the problem is, with regard to the writing of Black history and U.S. history, is that oftentimes these histories, they deal with a corner of U.S. life as opposed to sweeping syntheses of U.S. life. And by the way, as you mentioned in your all too kind introduction, I host a radio program every Saturday on kpfk.org, KPFK FM in Los Angeles, 90.7, replays on the Activist News Network, where I interview many of these scholars. And I've been doing this for years. And one of the points that one must walk away with is that because of the strength of the right wing in this country, because of the strength of white supremacy in this country, because of the potency of US imperialism, in order for Black people who have been the victim of all three to survive, we've had to internationalize the struggle. I mentioned the Haitian Revolution. I mentioned the connections with the rise of African independence movements. I could have gone into more detail about the specific role of Kwame Nkrumah, the founding father of independent Ghana in 1957, who then opened the doors in Accra to a flood of Black American exiles led by Paul Robeson, led by W.E.B. Du Bois, including Paul Robeson's closest comrade, speaking of W. Alpheus Hunton, for example, including Maya Angelou. Malcolm X passed through Ghana during Kwame Nkrumah's tenure. And these were international pressure points on Washington. In fact, in my book on Washington, D.C., Revolting Capital, which came out a few years ago, I pointed out the critical importance of Howard University, the historically Black college on the hilltop, because Howard University historically had been attracting Black students from the Caribbean and from Africa. The US authorities could not necessarily distinguish African students from African-American students. And so therefore, when they began to manhandle and roughhouse Nigerian students, it was causing international controversies. In fact, the State Department, as I point out in the book, at one point suggested that African students be given some sort of button that they could wear that would allow them to access restaurants and hotels that Black Americans would be barred from. I also point out that at that particular moment, you saw Americans began to assume African dress, wearing dashikis, et cetera, so making it much more difficult to distinguish Black Americans from Africans, for example. And that was part of our saving grace, this kind of approach. And so once again, for those who disdain internationalism, I wonder what they've been reading. At the same time, for example, I'm sensitive to these criticisms of the US left, many of which are well-founded. I mean, you have the spectacle in Europe right now, and to a degree in Canada, per Mark Carney's speech in Davos, where they're saying that even if Mr. Trump passes from the scene, Trumpism, they see, will be around for some decades to come. Whereas our friends on the left, they tend to take a romantic view, I would call a naive and idealistic view, that if you could just get rid of Trump, then everything would be hunky-dory and peachy keen, for example, which I think is terribly misleading. And I think it alienates many people in the Black community because we know in our bones that that can't be correct. Also, our friends on the left, they oftentimes tell us if the Democrats would only nominate social democrats, for example, as opposed to these centrists, then the Euro-American settler descendant working class that votes for Trump, they'd flock to the Democratic Party banner. Well, they don't even pay attention to what's happening today. Last year in New York, you had Mahmoud Mamdani, a social democrat, Z. Kwame Mamdani, with roots in Uganda and South Africa, elected as mayor of Gotham. He lost one borough of the 5 boroughs. Staten Island, the citadel of the settler descendant Euro-American working class, Italian-American, Irish-American, Jewish-American, for example. He also lost the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which is the headquarters of the 1%. That kind of class collaboration has been at the heart of what has created this so-called republic. I'm publishing a book. My first book of 2027 will deal with the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Portland, and its relationship to British Columbia right across the border. One of the points that I make in this book, that if you look at the dispossession of the indigenous, more so than being perpetrated by the US military, it was perpetrated by settlers in militia per the Second Amendment to the US Constitution. Oftentimes poor European or Euro-American settlers. And because they were poor, people say, oh, that's democracy. I mean, but they were committing genocide, for example. And they were committing genocide for the ultimate benefit of the 1%. And that has been the repetitive pattern in the history of the United States of America, a repetitive pattern which too often has been neglected by our friends on the left, which then leads to these wrong-headed conclusions, which you friends on the left, which then leads to these wrong-headed conclusions, which you just attributed to some of our so-called other Black Americans who are suspicious at best of many of our so-called allies.